Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Jen Wilson and the organizers for inviting me to speak to you. My background's in Gaelic linguistics and folklore, but increasingly over the last 13 years or so, I've been working on language technology. A lot of the work has involved collaboration with the BBC and also the School of Scottish Studies archives, hence the applicability or salience to what we're talking about today. But the main driver of this work and the reason that I got involved and the thing that keeps motivating me is the potential of language technology to help revitalize Scottish Gaelic and other minority languages through increasing competent speakers and providing current speakers with tools that I hope will be useful in the future. So the questions I'm going to try to address today are, could AI save Gaelic and other heritage languages? What are the current capabilities of Gaelic language technology specifically? How do we overcome data sparsity, which is a major issue for virtually all languages in the world apart from English and a handful of other ones? And how do we assess the impacts of AI, broadly speaking, on heritage languages? So let's start with, could AI save Gaelic? And my answer is very unlikely. I'm hedging because none of us really know what AI is going to be like in the future. If we had robots or something going around speaking Gaelic as well as any native speaker, who knows? But putting science fiction to one side, let's just think about this carefully. So we can use a thought experiment, which I think gets at the heart of the issue here. Imagine a cavernous room of identical desks set out in rows. And upon each desk is a laptop that can talk to you fluently in one of every language that's ever been spoken in the history of humanity. This is completely contrived. And I should say that 1/3 of the, 7,000 languages that are currently spoken, well, the documentation for that, 1/3 is limited to basically a word list. So you could never do this or anything even close. Anyway, would this kind of situation save the world's languages? The question that I think all of us need to think about is, if you could interact with a computer in any language, and that's great if you know what language it is, but as we move on into the future, languages change, they get lost, etc. And what relevance would any one of these random kind of computers that streams the sound have for you? The point being, this has nothing to do with culture and communication, which is what languages are ultimately for. So let's see, if we move from this digital mausoleum to a situation where humans are in the room, let's see how that changes things. So if we replace every computer with a single human speaker for each language, or maybe two, identify by simple label a piece of paper in front of them, would that save humanity's languages? For English, what if the speaker is a 22-year-old middle-class black woman from Baltimore? Or what if it's a 78-year-old upper-class white man from London? Which is more representative to the English language, do you think? There's no answer to that question, but I think the point is that as soon as you represent a language by a single speaker, whether it's a synthetic voice or a human being, you lose all the variety that makes that language alive. So as we're trying to develop tools using technology, we need to think very carefully about representation. What are we actually providing to the public? What informs those decisions? Because if you don't do that, then obviously you have all kinds of cases where representation is at risk, and you're pulling in a lot of ethical concerns as well. So the point being, the take home is, if you fix a language to a single point, then you lose all the variation that gives it life in the first place. So is AI useless? No, I don't think it is. But we need to shift the focus from saving languages to helping revitalize a pre-existing community. So what do we mean by revitalization? Well, I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Let's kind of start by looking at what we can do with Gaelic language technology right now. So we're a bit behind our colleagues in Wales and Ireland for various reasons. I mean, currently there is only a handful of people that can code and also who speak Gaelic fluently. I count myself amongst them, but I can only think of 3 or 4 other people across Scotland. Our funding is a lot lower, although we do have substantial funding now from the Scottish Government. If there's anybody from the Scottish Government, thank you very much. And a few other organizations, but I mean, it pales in comparison to what, say Irish and Welsh have received over the years. But we can do things like handwriting recognition, part-of-speech tagging, speech recognition, speech synthesis, machine translation, text normalization to an extent. That's complicated. With computer-assisted language learning, we can do some things, but we can't automate them very well yet. Duolingo for Scottish Gaelic has been a runaway success. Over 2 million people have accessed that now, so it's one of the biggest heritage languages on Duolingo. That's a huge Pandora's box. Very difficult what they're trying to do now. They're moving everything to an AI-focused approach, which compromises the programs that they have for heritage languages like Gaelic. What we can't do, and what a lot of the learners really want, is conversational AI. But that also is a problem, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Our kind of flagship project is called Éist, with a grave accent. The Irish one goes up. We kind of stole their name slightly. But it breaks down to ecosystem for interactive speech technology. So that's kind of what we're focusing on, getting to the point where we can build conversational AI for Scottish Gaelic. What we're focusing on right now is state-of-the-art speech recognition, specifically for subtitling in Gaelic for the BBC. So we can't force the BBC in any way to provide Gaelic subtitles, but to date, on all the programming, it's basically limited to English subtitles, so it disadvantages people like me who are kind of slightly hard of hearing, if you want to have subtitles in Gaelic, there's no way currently to receive that. Also, a lot of programs don't allow you to switch off the English subtitles, doing a bit of a jumbled mess in your head as you're watching programs. So it'd be really great if they could do that. So we've been working on that technology. There's another side, which is to provide transcription to Gaelic medium education classrooms to level the playing field with English and other majority languages. And to get there and push things on a bit, we are starting a crowdsourcing program that I'll talk about in a few minutes that involves archival content on an archive portal called Tobrandóchis, our Kist of Riches, which contains stuff from the School of Scottish Studies archives as well as the BBC. So I'm just going to give you a blast of the speech recognition as it exists right now. I'll see if the sound comes through the speakers. If not, I'll pull this mic down.
Yn cairach ag eithís yn jalan agus gas a dol suas iddiís sy'n nŵliach. Drag ym ysgfenchner mewn fwy orysyn agus at edrych coni I iawri a chawl.
Rwy'n ni'n cydyn hanedd o'n ddioch o tra yn la. Agus chawys ni'n cydyn hichting, central hichting o tra tadol hyn ys tra yn nain. Hamid o'n lepyn ys tra.
Roeg de grijveren kunnen we school het roodje toe het me aan de halpe en we sturen die studden bert en maandag. Real tussen halpe graag en veel policy in Gaelic fjärste horster zie je een social te is economach als de skieden tradition te voor willy haas kapli. Ik zei de hier het laat de grinje gevlianal gaat er geschrochtje dag naar halpe ga je bjachtige gesorichtje if shalaf koersnap.
Okay, so Gaelic didn't used to be a show. I should have asked if anyone had Gaelic here. Becan, okay, Gleva, okay, didn't know Gij. So you mightn't, if you didn't have Gaelic, obviously you wouldn't be able to tell, but that was right off the cuff from the system with no post-production or editing or anything. And the technology now is pretty far advanced. We can get, for something like that, that's semi-scripted, or in that case, actually very scripted, we're getting over 90% accuracy now, so less than a 10% word error rate. For radio interviews, and that comprises most of the training data that we've supplied, to build the models, we're getting roughly about 88 to 89% accuracy. So it's a far cry from where we were even like 2 years ago, where we're getting more like 77.4% accuracy. So the system is now probably, I say probably, but I think it's usable for at least a first pass transcription for the purpose of generating subtitles. You wouldn't want to kind of, release it to the public, or I should say you wouldn't want to release the first pass transcriptions as subtitles on a broadcast program, but certainly it would get you a long way towards producing a perfect transcription. To improve, speech recognition models, once you've gotten to this point in particular, it requires orders of magnitude more data than you already have. So we've got about 300 hours right now of verbatim transcriptions coupled with the original audio. But to get to, say, I don't know, like 93% accuracy, we would need to have 10 times more data. So you have diminishing returns as you get closer to that kind of perfect, like 0% word error. So how do we do that? This brings in data scarcity. As I said, it's a massive problem for almost all languages as you're trying to develop language technology. So I want to talk a few minutes about that. And this is where the collaboration between what we're trying to do in archives comes to the fore. So I think that there are 4 different kind of steps that you probably want to take when you're trying to build up training data for language technology. One is to obviously start with the low-hanging fruit. What are the things that you already have? What are the corpora that you can tap into easily? So you collect the pre-existing digital sources. They can be, as I said, online corpora, folklore and media archives, etc. I'll come back to some of these in a second. Then you digitize and recognize any analog sources that you have, although that's very, very expensive. You can try a cheap approach, synthetic augmentation using large language models. That will give you various levels of success, and there's some dangers there I'll talk about again in a couple of minutes. And then crowdsourcing. So let's look at these. There are public data sets, even for a language like Scottish Gaelic. So MadLad 400, which sounds like some kind of a Terminator robot. It's actually a large corpus, about 150 million words or something like that for Scottish Gaelic that's online. Now, has anybody read through this? No. I've looked at kind of random bits of it, and it's pretty horrible in places. So I think it's, a range of probably very good sources, like human-edited Wikipedia pages, but also a lot of machine translation and increasingly probably synthetic text from large language models. So it'll get you some of the way there, but it's not going to be hugely reliable. You can request access to private digitized data sets, but you've got to get through various hoops, agreements with data controllers, so the archives and the media, so going to the BBC. I mean, we're very, very fortunate that BBC Alapa has been hugely supportive of what we're trying to do. So we've been lucky there. But increasingly, with folklore archives like the School of Scottish Studies archives, recently people are starting to say, actually, we don't want our data used for AI because it's got such a bad name. Now, people don't understand often that there are different types of language technology, and it's all about chatbots these days. But when you're doing speech recognition, the risks are a lot lower than when you're dealing with chatbots, and the advantages for the language community are actually a lot higher too. So it's important to do some public education here. There's another side, of course, which is copyright issues. So even dealing with pre-existing sources, you've got a lot of challenges. One of the major projects that we've had over the last few years is decoding hidden heritages, which involved Brian and colleagues at DCU as well as UCD and University of Durham. And in Scotland, we digitized a whole subcorpus of the School of Scottish Studies archives dealing with traditional narrative. And then we used handwriting recognition, so we trained handwriting recognition models to go through all of those millions of words and put them in a digital text. And now we're at the stage of coupling that text with the original audio to help train the language models as well as the audio or acoustic models that we need for speech recognition. But as I said, this is very expensive. That was, I think, all told, something like £600,000 to do that in Scotland and in Ireland. You can take a synthetic augmentation approach, so you can use a large language model to generate synthetic text. One of the ways that you can do that is to train a model to pair a summary in a high resource language, like English, with an original text in your target low resource language. So you use fine tuning to train a large language model like GPT-4o. And then you can produce these larger texts with a small prompt. We've done this for traditional narrative, so Gaelic traditional narrative, as well as news reportage. It was more successful with news reportage. It actually did help us put a dent in the error rate for speech recognition. With traditional narrative, it's less successful, and we think that's because there's less, obviously traditional narrative in the pre-training data that was used for GPT. So, it really depends. And for most of the languages in the world, you won't even be able to do this because the pre-training data in that language is so small. We're just very lucky with Gaelic. So turning to the other potential crowdsourcing. So we're following the lead of our colleagues at UCD. Brian mentioned Virtuous, which is an amazing and very successful initiative to get members of the public to type out handwritten manuscripts that were all folklore manuscripts produced from over 100 years ago, I think in some cases, and to type them out in Irish and Hiberno English primarily. So we're trying to do that with audio. We have a much smaller pool of people that we can pull from. There are a lot less fluent speakers of Scottish Gaelic who can listen to folklore from the 1940s and 50s and type it out. But they do exist, so we're hoping that we can get at least a good few hundred people to collaborate with us on this. We're also going to make it a little bit easier for them because we do have folklore data in our training data for the speech recognition system. We can do a first pass of the transcription. And it'll have various levels of success because sometimes the acoustic environment is really bad. You'll have dogs barking, sheep in the background, domestics going on, whatever. But sometimes with clean audio, you can get really good recognition. So that'll help them. And then we'll provide those transcriptions back to the Gaelic community on Tópid and Dulcish on the website, as well as putting them back to the BBC and the School of Scottish Studies archives. And because we'll incorporate a program of copyright and permissions in this as well, we'll be using as much of that as possible to help improve the speech recognition models. So just to turn to the last topic, kind of assessing impacts of language technology and heritage languages, we could start with some of the risks. So just to briefly look at these, you've got information hazards. So this comes from the proliferation of synthetic text. And for Gaelic, that's existed since Google Translate, which I'm a little bit embarrassed to say I helped facilitate. And it's probably the bane of a lot of people's existence who are trying to teach Gaelic. As you have more and more synthetic text appearing on the internet, you can, using data from the internet becomes inherent. It becomes less, reliable to do that. And if you do that unwittingly and then train large language models on that synthetic text again and again and again, it becomes, a case where you can have your models just collapse altogether. They become really, really samey, really vanilla, and essentially less accurate over time. And we don't want that. You've also got issues with representation bias, which I mentioned before, and we were talking about, kind of how we should represent, especially a heritage language. You've got to think about dialects, gender, age, in some cases socioeconomic background. All of these things are very important to get right. Environmental harms, all of us are aware of the environmental difficulties of LLMs, particularly in the training phase where you're spewing out huge amounts of CO2. A company called DeepSeek in China showed that it was possible to make large language models at a fraction of the impact, but there still is an impact. And then finally, socioeconomic harms. So if you can, train a large language model to do the job of human beings, particularly with heritage languages, you're putting those few very talented people out of work, then that's obviously not great for the language community either. So these are things we need to keep an eye on. More positively, there are some potentials for revitalisation. So the goals of revitalisation efforts tend to be around increasing active speakers, developing resources, diversifying usage domains, raising status and viability. And I think for the first and the second and the fourth, we can do this probably with language technology. That third thing is a little bit more difficult, because if you're thinking about trying to get people to speak a heritage language more in their communities, then it's a very indirect thing if you're using language technology. There's no way to make people do that if they're unwilling to do that. But the other things can maybe contribute to that over time. Ultimately, we can't have a thriving language in any sense without a thriving speech community. So, this is very, very important to get right. Looking at speech recognition, the main risks there are linguistic distortion. So, if your models aren't that accurate, then it's going to transcribe the speech that's coming into them inaccurately, and then if people aren't aware of that and it goes out on the internet, then it reflects badly on the language. It might be ungrammatical, the spelling might be awful, the words might be entirely wrong. The representation bias is also a problem. So if all of your training data is from one dialect and you're trying to recognize a breadth of dialects, then that's a problem. We started out being able to recognize US Gaelic very, very well, and not so much Lewis Gaelic, where all the speakers live. But over time, not all the speakers, but like a huge number of them, over time, it's gotten to the case where, or to the point where Lewis Gaelic is recognized very, very well. Some of the potentials there with speech recognition are developing resources. So we've put millions of words back into a large archive at the University of Glasgow called DASC, or Corpus na Gaelic. So speech recognition work has, meant that they've got a huge amount, more kind of linguistic data to play with. And of course, we can raise status and visibility with speech recognition, particularly if it's built into computers and phones, etc. With LLMs, there are a lot more risks. You've got linguistic distortion, of course, cultural distortion. So if you ask a large language model in Gaelic about something about Gaelic culture, for example, I tried this a while back, do Gaels still believe in fairies? And I think it came out with yes, large numbers of Gaelic speakers still believe in fairies. And I was like, I'm not so sure about that. So you've got model collapse as well, as I mentioned. The more garbage we put on the internet of bad synthetic text, the more these models kind of become even worse. Environmental harms, as we mentioned, the socioeconomic harms. So are there revitalization potentials? Well, I think so. I mean, as we get better with LLMs, as they work with Gaelic better, and I should say, just to reinforce what was said in one of the other lectures, I think it was Chris on Welsh, Anthropic's Claude model is actually a very, very good one now for Gaelic. So if we build LLMs into sensitive, really good uses of call computer-assisted language learning, then maybe we can increase active users. We can raise the status and viability and visibility, certainly, but we need to think about mitigating these risks as well. So how do we do that? Well, involving the community in the design and evaluation of language technology is important. Creating an accessible, high-quality training corpus, I think, is of principal importance. As I said, that doesn't exist for Gaelic. I doubt that, well, actually with Irish they're much further ahead, and with Welsh they're much further ahead, but for a lot of language communities that doesn't exist. So we can't just allow these huge, 150 million word corpora to exist without some health warning on them and say, look, don't use that, use this, it's smaller, but at least it's good. Signpost all synthetic text and media, we should all be doing that. And using closed systems for generative AI so that we don't, spew out more and more garbage into the training ecosystem. And finally, educating the community on generative AI itself. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what AI is. I had a question the other day when I was giving a lecture to Gaelic speakers in the United States. Is today's AI built on built on, what is it? It's a type of computer, just going right on my head, having a senior moment, but basically built on a type of computer that doesn't exist at all. Like, and I was like, no, that it's like, this stuff isn't conscious. It's not at all like aware. It's just a prediction machine. That's all it is. So it's important that people understand that that's all they really are. They're fancy calculators. So I'm going to leave it there. A thank you to our supporters and funders, and Jochen Bauer, Tap Lupain. Thank you very much.